great, fine. It's just a Zoom.
Mhm.
Right. So I'll just formally welcome Helga Vierich. We're incredibly pleased to be able to welcome to these series of radical anthropology seminars. Helga really represents a kind of four field anthropology approach. I think that's fair enough to say,
Mhm.
with both a cultural anthropology, evolutionary anthropology, archaeology, and linguistics type of background. It's the sort of interdisciplinary approach that we've always tried to follow in radical anthropology group. So we're really interested to hear what you have to say on this question of sex division of labour and your general experience and thoughts on the matter.
Mhm.
So over to you, and talk for as long as you feel like,
Oh,
and we'll then have discussion.
yeah. So I'll just introduce myself a little bit more detail. I did my doctoral program at the University of Toronto. I initially was going to go into archaeology. I did a summer dig at a place called Nasherini in Lebanon with a team put together by Bruce Schroeder. And that research, that dig, was one of the last ones done there because, of course, the Civil War and everything else that happened since then made it impossible to go back. And so Richard Lee, who was another one of my um, instructors there, said, "Why not? Since I had funding and grants and so on, why not switch and do something in ethnography of hunter gatherers?" Because I was already talking to a man called Henry Lewis, at the University of Alberta about fire ecology. Okay, and I was very interested in the role of ecological engineering among hunter-gatherers, particularly as it was, to my mind, an intensification of this, which eventually led to domestication of plants and animals. In any event, I was, thinking about going to Alberta to do research following up on what Hank Lewis had done. And then Richard Lee stepped in and said, "No, why not go to the Kalahari? I can get you in there." And after a wonderful lunch with Pat Draper and Henry Harpending, I got the use of a vehicle. Richard set that up, and off I went. And I did, in the end, well, not quite 4 years in the Kalahari. I did a drought survey towards the end of that time. However, I couldn't do fire ecology because the Botswana government had just um, initiated a law against all kinds of veldt burning, and people got fined and jailed and stuff if they set fire to the landscape. So I couldn't very well do interviews on that. And it took me a long time to actually get the data on that, until things kind of calmed down. And so I had to switch, and I wound up being really interested in the interface between hunter gatherers and the farming and pastoral people. And I wound up doing my PhD on that. And what I found out was very interesting to my mind. It was that the interface was really a zone of um, uh, shall we say, economic experimentation on the part of the Bushmen. Okay, I call them Bushmen because in the end, they told me they wanted to be called Basarwa. All this stuff about San and Koi San and everything is kind of politically correct, but they never even heard those terms. So Basarwa just means Bushman in Bantu, in the Bantu language. And in their own languages, they didn't have a term for themselves except the real people. Okay. Koi. In other words, their language name, which was Kwa, and then Koi, which means, the real people. I suspect every cultural group has a similar feeling about themselves. Anyway, okay, so I was very lucky in that this group had long past any kind of interest or fascination with the herding and farming culture and the sort of outside world that was brought to them more recently, and they were very conscious of the racism with which they were um, faced, in these other cultures and rejected them. I still remember one of my closest, I don't know, if I would call it a friend or an informant, Cloatre said one day, he said, if you ever see me with a chicken, I'm translating now, it's my chicken. I'm not looking after it for some, Bakalahari guy, and that kind of illustrates to me the rejection of the role of serf or even employee. Okay, most of the people I knew had at some point or other been closer to working for as a herd boy or as an assistant in a agricultural operation doing bird scaring and harvesting or cooking or looking after kids in a camp or something like that. And they did this, it became very clear they did this because by filling in at times of labor shortages, they were very much more tolerated by the people who now controlled the main permanent water points. Okay. Okay, now there's another topic I'd like to get into, but I can't because there's no time. And that is what happened to their hunting systems and their interaction with wildlife and so on as a result of the what they called the totally stupid hunting practices of the Bantu dogs and clubs and hunting on horseback and everything else. But I'll get into that in another talk if I'm permitted. Okay, so the reason I am here today is because I think it was sometime last year, in the early part of the year, there was a report from South America about the excavation of a young person who turned out to be female, but who was buried with hunting paraphernalia, you know. Okay, and there were a number of very excited reports about this. Hang on, I'm just going to call them up so I can, if they will. Oh yeah. Um, One of them, the main research article was published in Science Advances, and that was last November 2020. And it was Female Hunters of the Early Americas. Okay. Randall Haas, James Watson, etc. et al. Okay. And what they what they basically then did was they questioned sexual division of labor among hunters and gatherers. They said, this was kind of a standard empirical reality that most people had suggested based on ethnographic data. And it was then inferred to be the ancestral behavioral pattern. Okay, so then they suggested that their discovery of this girl with the hunting paraphernalia challenges the man hunter hypothesis. Okay. And of course, this was in the Andes, but and it was a burial of that was about 9,000 years old, and so on. Most of you are familiar with this. Okay. It was picked up all over the place on Inverse, and somebody called Sarah Wells actually wrote actually, ancient big game hunters were women. In prehistoric hunting wasn't just a man's game, et cetera, with predictable. And there was an article which I can't remember where it appeared, but it was a picture of a young girl in a pink dress throwing a spear at a bunch of wild vicuñas, I guess. Anyway, so anyway, this caused a great deal of excitement, and it was picked up here as well, and then it was picked up on Twitter and everywhere else. And I was I was almost amused by it. First of all, there is no man the hunter hypothesis that I'm aware of. Okay, that title, "Man the Hunter," was the title of the conference, the Man the Hunter conference, the original hunter gatherer conference, and it was decided by Werner Gren, who were the funders. The book that subsequently followed, edited by Richard Lee and Irvin DeVore, was also called that. And I think, it was not only just for continuity, but it was because it was a kind of a catchy title, and they didn't want to fight with Werner Grin about the funding, etc. So the thing is that it upset a lot of people who were feminist at that time. Somebody even wrote a book called Woman the Gatherer. And this is very ironic because, most of you realize Richard Lee, in that edited volume and at that conference, was the one who pointed out that his research indicated that women were supplying, 75 to 80% of all the calories. All right. Um, he even expressed dismay that it was titled this way and that it put him under attack, okay, by people who felt, that the role of women was being minimized, etc. But there is in our society, um, and has been throughout probably the history of civilization, a kind of a glorification of men as hunters. You see it on the tombs of the Egyptian pharaohs. There they are, killing some poor leopard or, eland or something with their chariots. You see it today when, the guy who runs that, what is it? I can't remember which big corporate guy this is, but he goes off to Africa and kills elephants, baby elephants, and stands over them like he's a great hunter. This is a this is a meme, as it were, that has persisted, and it has infected a lot of people and the way that they view hunting as an activity. All right. Well, when I got to the field and I got a little bit better at the language, I always spoke basically children's language or baby talk, if you will, but because it's a really, really hard language to learn. It's got like, I don't know how many, I think it was 39 different sounds, and there was clicks and toning and everything. I once asked a man if I could, I got the tone wrong and asked a man if I could leave my camera equipment in his wife's vagina. The hut word for hut and vagina is very, very, very close. And that's a kind of mistake. So I was a subject of considerable humor, I think. But anyway, so I started asking um, the women I knew, and the picture that was put up to announce this talk is very indicative because the two girls that I'm sitting with became my best friends. Okay, they were the ones who jollied me off to go and do a gathering with them. All right. And I became more accepted, as a part of the scene because of them. And Malapai, the middle one, actually ran a trap line at one point. So that interested me. And I started to ask about whether or not she and, some of the other girls I knew aspired to be hunters and felt, kind of pushed away from that by the men. And they laughed at me. They said, "Why would you wanna be a hunter?" You know? I mean, young men, do aspire to be good hunters. That seemed pretty clear to me. So I said, "Well, why wouldn't you?" And they said, "Well, for one thing," um, and I don't I suppose they've been told about this, or perhaps some of them had tried it. In any event, for one thing, they said, you walk around all day, either with your, instructor, the person you're apprenticed to, or by yourself, if you're supposed to be trying to hunt by yourself, which is the aim, I guess, ultimately of becoming a good hunter. You walk around all day in silence. You can't talk to anybody. You can't even sing. You have to be careful even to sneeze in case you scare something. And you know, most of the time you come home empty-handed, and it's hot and you're covered with thorn scrapes and mosquito bites, and you know and you're miserable. You come home miserable because again you didn't succeed. Like the hunting success ratio, the average is 1 hunt in 4 is successful. Okay, what that means, well, that's just the average. The success rate of men over 35, was higher. It was sort of like one in every third or second hunt. The success rate of the youngest men who were just learning was way lower. It was like 1 in 7 hunts. Okay. Now, can you imagine what that's like? You go out and it's hot because they hunt during the day. That's another story that uh, I'd like to explore, when did this night hunting with dogs start? But anyway, um, you hunt during the day, you hunt as quietly as possible, you wander around for hours, you follow tracks, you try to get close enough to animals to hit them with a poison arrow, right? And at that point, the animal will continue going on, probably sort of itching and bruising at that spot until it feels the paralysis coming on, and then it will seek someplace to go lie down. In the meantime, you hare back to camp and you get, all the men that you can to come with you to make sure it gets tracked properly. Because if you're a young hunter, your tracking skills are not that good. Okay. It's very hard to learn to track um, properly in this kind of sandy environment. And you're going to need assistance in, first of all, uh, uh, preventing other predators from zeroing in on this animal. Okay. And also to, butcher it and get it home. All right. So then, okay, so that was the goal. And if you manage that, uh, uh, you were, it was clear that it was a group effort. Okay. It wasn't some great hunter, being being the supplier of meat or anything. It was a lucky hit. In fact, most of the time, what I heard, and I was able to tag after these guys when they went after such an animal a couple of times, was that you know um, this was an animal that had sacrificed itself for the sake of the children in the camp. This was an animal that had decided, to help its brothers, the humans. And I remember one day, the first time I went out, one of the older men stopped when we came in sight of the animal, which was down. Now it was down under a tree. And he sighed and he said, "Oh, oh, it's her." He knew this animal. He'd known it for years. He'd seen it have babies, and on this occasion, this was the one that caught the arrow. So that's the atmosphere. All right. So then I asked, but okay, so it's hard and you can't talk very much, but and it doesn't give you very much kind of benefit at the end of the day. And what the girl said then, and she said, well, that's why we let the men do it, because you can't talk, you can't sing, you can't joke, you can't tell stories, you can't gossip while you're doing it like you can when you're gathering. I mean, I've been on those gathering trips. I mean, the ones where they didn't want me to come were ones where I guess either they were talking about me or they were discussing very, delicate matters of, love and marriage or whatever, and didn't, wanted privacy. But the times that I was able to go gathering with them, not that I gathered much, I mostly just carried my camera, but um, it was just endless chatter, jokes, especially talking about the guys, and gossip that people had picked up, and just little dances, impromptu, and singing and stuff like this. And that it was a lively, fun outing compared to the way that hunting was described. And the most important thing of all was that you always came home with plenty of food. There were no like failed gathering trips, right? You're not going to go out there and go, oh, I don't see any nuts in the trees. I don't know where the roots are. No, they knew this whole area like the back of like a garden. In fact, they called it a garden. In fact, they have gardened it in the sense that, well, they were making the landscape more productive with every trip, for the future. When I was walking along the first few times, I was really puzzled to see women taking some nuts or some berries, out of their pouches. We'd just been gathering these things, right? And I had to stop because they were healing the bunches of it into the ground, and they did like 3 or 4 times on our way home. And I said, "What are you doing?" And there, of course, because I always ask questions and I was hot and bothered. And they said, "Well, we have to give something back to the mother, right?" But if you consider the consequences of just that, okay, aside from all the times that stuff sort of fell out of their fell out of their karosses every time they plunked them down to dig a root or something, okay? Because there were always stuff falling out. I used to be trying to be really helpful. I'd scoop stuff up and try to put it back in, and they laughed at me. And they said, "Don't." Um, so all of this stuff, the whole, provisioning expedition of gathering, scattered seeds and berries and nuts, in other words, the babies of the mother, everywhere. And if you think this is women do this maybe 3 times, maximum 4 a week, because they gather enough to last for 2 days for their household, okay? Um, the the mathematics, I once tried to figure it out just for the group I was with, which was about 1,000 people, all in, the whole language area. And within like 100 years, they would have planted like 10 million plants. That's minimum, assuming just 6 per trip. Okay. But if each woman is doing this, just do the math in your head. This is major ecological engineering, and most of it's done without even planning anything. Okay. It's about gratitude, it's about reciprocity at that point. Okay. So the gathering activities, and this isn't even counting the sort of ecological hotspots that are created around every one of these temporary camping sites, because people spit stuff out, they throw things into the midden, the withered little roots and stuff that don't get eaten, they go into the midden. The little kids are told, put that thing away in the midden before it dies. Okay, so the the old camping sites were just immensely productive after probably after a 10-year period or so. You could always count on finding edible roots and berries and nuts and certain kinds of uh, um, plum trees and so on growing there. And we would actually during the winter, during the dry season, we would actually sometimes zigzag among old camping sites on our way back, just to sort of fill up on stuff easily, because in the winter, there wasn't that much in the way of fresh fruit. And so having a lot of different groves that you could go to was really beneficial. The other thing was root crops. It was full of root crops because these things have been replanted. Okay. So, looked at in terms of the subsistence economy and division of labor of hunter gatherers, what women do gathering is not only more fun, always productive, and relatively shall we say, unarduous, really. I mean, they carry a lot, but they don't seem to worry about the weight of it, because the heavier it gets, the closer they are to camp, right? And then they can rest for 2 days, do other stuff. In any event, what the women do is not only, dependable and fun, but it's also ecologically completely critical to the hunter gatherer relationship with their ecosystem. All right. And I think looking at it from a kind of, you know, division of labor point of view, there another thing becomes clear, at least to me, and it was clear to them too, because it was a who was it? It was Beke or Beke's son. I can't remember which one said it. I was doing hunting interviews because I did tons of these interviews on hunts, and one of them just said, "Well, you realize, that if we didn't have the women gathering, we couldn't afford to waste all this time hunting." They said that. He didn't say waste. He said to while away our time. Translating badly, but in other words, this obligation to bring meat into camp, it was enough to actually depress young men when they were unsuccessful when they were young. A lot of the trance dances that I saw were for treating people who were so depressed by their lack of hunting success that they'd fallen into a depression and they'd refused to get up, and they were still lying in their on their karosses for days and days. And then the whole group would get together and they'd have a trance dance and a big celebration, and this person would be kind of jollied back into a state of hopefulness, like we're going to cure your bad luck, you're going to keep trying, and so on. Hunting is hard, right? Because it's um, the least rewarding of the activities that hunter gatherers undertake. That is my impression. Um, and I know that this contradicts the view of many of the archaeologists who are excavating, sites 100,000, 300,000, no, three, well, yeah, a long time ago, of our hunter-gatherer past, because what they get is the lithic remains of the hunting toolkit, right? And some of it has, I think, been misinterpreted as a hunting toolkit, because some of these scrapers and other things could just as easily be used to process and dismember plants. But the thing is, hunting was not done as a male activity that excluded females. All right, men were perfectly um, happy to come gathering. It's the women didn't want them because they wanted to gossip about the guys. Sorry, it sounds awful, but it was not necessary for the men to come. Plus, young men did not apprentice with their female relatives to learn where every type of plant grows, to learn how to gather all these different things, and to learn that part of the landscape. They were more encouraged to learn animal behavior, to understand um, aspects of how to make arrows so they fly straight, to target practice, and especially to handle the poisons, and so on. This division of labor, I think, functioned not because of male domination or anything, but because it was practical, and from an ecological standpoint, what hunting did, and I think this is really important, what what hunters do when they're out observing animals and trying to get close to them and so on, is they keep very good track of the status, the health status, um, the reproductive activities of these animals. They know what can be harvested, to what extent. They also keep pretty good track of all the kills made by lions and other predators in the environment. And one of the things that this does, I think, is it means that they hunt in a conscious way to not over harvest certain species that are vulnerable. I once sat through like a 3 hour, no, it was longer than that, debate or discussion or whatever it was, that was occasioned by the fact that a man had actually killed a female eland, and instead of letting the eland calf come to life, as it were. And that was a no-no. Okay, if you were going to hunt, you tried to hunt selectively, so you were hunting a healthy animal because you didn't want to pick up the diseases carried by sick animals, right? um, you wanted an animal that was sort of in good fitness, because you wanted the fat that the animal carried. And so you valued the activities of your fellow hunters, the lions, the leopards, the cheetahs. Why? Because those animals, and this has been shown now, thank goodness, by wildlife ecologists in Canada, they selectively prey on animals that are sick. Okay. Prion diseases especially are very dangerous. As you probably know, they survive cooking because it's not actually an organism, right? It's a misformed, misaligned protein of some kind. And and prion diseases, the danger exists worldwide. And it's only lately that we've come to realize how bad they can be. In the United States right now, many of the wildlife services are recommending that people do not eat venison because there's such an epidemic of what's called chronic wasting disease among the deer. Well, what brought that on? It's they killed all the cougars, they killed all the wolves, so the disease is just rampant among these deer, and it's spreading fast. Okay. The Bushmen knew. They told me, they said, these animals are our brothers. They keep us healthy because they keep the animals healthy. And I'm not the only person that's ever been told this. This was explained to, what was his name again? Farley Mowat, who did some book on people of the deer, on caribou hunters up north. And they told him too that the wolves kept the deer healthy. The herds, needed them. And this deep ecological understanding, this symbiosis that is going on here is really important, you know. And so I'm not saying that hunting as such is an unimportant part of the hunter-gatherer economy, but I think in terms of our understanding of how the whole hunter-gatherer um, cultural ecology worked, how it evolved, that this was, both of them were critical, you know. I tell this story sometimes, so if I have time I'd like to repeat it. It's about giraffe. Is that okay? You familiar with this one? Okay. Well, as you know, Lorna Marshall's son made a film uh, called The Hunters, and it follows some people up in Ngami land, where much of the field work has been done among a language group different from the one I was with, about 800, almost 1,000 miles to the north west. Anyway, he follows a giraffe hunt. Okay, and so they hit the giraffe, and of course poison arrows. Giraffes are, anyway. So it's a long, long hunt, and in the end, they kill this giraffe with spears. Actually, they pulled it down with a truck, but that, or shot it with a, but anyway, never mind. So I had seen this film and I was very impressed. And so when I came to the Kalahari, there were plenty of giraffe. I mean, not plenty, but I certainly saw giraffe quite frequently in the area where I was doing field work. But you know what? Nobody was hunting them. No, none of the Kua were hunting them. And so after a while, after X number of, 100 hunting interviews, I asked about this, and I was told, "Oh, well, it's for a very good reason." And some of them were a little hazy about this. I was told to go speak to somebody. This lady who lived, like about 100 miles to the east of where I was doing these interviews. So I eventually got out to see her, and she was this little granny, right? She's sitting there in a camp. The other women have gone gathering. A couple of old men are sleeping under the lean-tos, and she's kind of got the kids around her. And so I went ahead, and explained what I was interested in. I wanted to ask her about giraffe. She brightened right up. She was so pleased. I think most people in her society probably were really tired of hearing her talk about giraffe, because she's one of these obsessed people, from childhood. She wanted to know everything about giraffes. Anyway, so I asked the question. I said, why shouldn't the giraffe be hunted? I've noticed that the young men here don't hunt the giraffe. And she said, "Oh, it's the midwife of the acacia." Okay. So I go, okay, and I write this down, I'm thinking, and then, I asked her more questions, and it gradually came out, she had noticed that acacia seeds would pass through the giraffe, be deposited at quite distant, and then sprout. In fact, that seemed to be the main thing that was spreading these acacias. By the way, they're not scientifically labeled as acacias anymore, but you know what I mean. These big, sort of fan-shaped giant trees that you see in the Central African savanna regions. Okay, so, and then she told me, she said, God made the giraffe tall enough to take the babies of the acacia, in other words, the seed pods, and spread them. Okay, that's why we say it's a midwife. It was only years later that I learned that the acacia is a legume. It fixes nitrogen in its roots with a symbiosis with the bacteria, right? And it is because of the spread of the acacia that the Kalahari remains as green as it does. In other words, spreading nitrogen. This is a very, very sandy soil type, and not really rich in nutrients. But having these trees that are basically giant, like legumes, really opens up the environment to other species of plants, and that of course leads to more animal diversity as well. There's another thing there, the so-called um, marama nut, which is also a legume. Okay, and by the way, marama nuts were what these women were often dropping on their gathering trips. So just think of the observational and knowledge that that sort of sums up. Like, she didn't know how to explain why the acacia was the essential plant in the Kalahari, and that the animal that spreads this plant is vitally important. Okay, but she knew, and I think that sums up like hundreds of years, thousands of years of observation and discussion, and what we call wisdom, if you will. It's the first science of mankind, is ecological engineering. And I won't even get into fire ecology unless there's time. Okay, uh, does that open up, if I talk long enough? I can't hear
Yeah,
you.
yeah, no, just unmute. Yeah, well, that sets things up. I mean, perhaps if people ask questions, you can come up, respond, and
Mhm,
that will get things going.
mhm.
That was already a really great picture. I think that's fantastic with the giraffes there. Um, does anybody have burning questions to ask at this point? I
Chris?
have a
No?
few, but
I-
Chris,
yeah.
go.
Well, it's just that I first knew of your work when I heard the story, the trickster story about God's testicles, and you were
Oh,
mentioning,
yeah, yeah.
and you were mentioning how the women, when they're gathering, they laugh a lot. And I just wondered if you could tell us that story, and anything else around that whole topic, because of course the issue of whether hunter-gatherers are sort of cowering in the face of kings in the form of their gods, or whether they actually their divinities are are tricksters, has been quite a controversial topic recently.
Mhm. Oh, well, that it's actually an important question. I appreciate it, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about this. Um, they had when I was able to uh, get that depth of interview going, they had a concept of a single creator. Okay, kind of a spiritual creator of the entire universe, who sort of animated everything. They said the two things that came from the immaterial, the spiritual, the unknown side of reality were fire and love. Okay, and love was not just love, right? It was the animate. It was life. Okay, it was what made things alive. All right, and so I finally got the name. I can't even remember what it is now, and it's unimportant because they told me we don't know the real name of the creator, because how can we know it? It's immaterial. So then my next question, because I had my copy of notes and records with me, was what would be the uh, you know is your god male or female? I couldn't believe such a stupid question. They said, you know, what? Well, if it manifests on Earth, then quite often, if it's human or any other species of animal, then it's going to come out as male or female. But that's just what happens in a material form. An immaterial being does not need genitalia. They don't pee, they don't screw, they don't they don't they don't have sex. What are you thinking? And I realized how stupid that question was. Okay, so there's that. Now, here's the thing. There are a lot of sort of stories that I was told were sacred. Okay. And one of them was the story of the bees chasing testicles. Now that with that, introduction to it, I had to ask that it be told to me, of course. And the story goes that God, this immaterial creator being, was looking down and on the world, and he was following, for some reason, maybe they mentioned his name, I don't know, or her name, who knows, um, uh, following a group of gathering women, and he was particularly entranced by one young woman in the group, and uh, basically wanted to get closer to her, and as a result, he popped into material existence as a small human. Now, I don't know if this was like a homunculus, like a miniature man, or whether it's supposed to have been a child. They didn't describe it. In any event, this little being popped into existence, and he was following these women as they were gathering, and everything that he saw them gathering, if they stopped at a nut grove and got a bunch of nuts, he would follow and eat a bunch of nuts as well. And as he was eating everything that they were gathering, as he saw them gathering, he was growing into, a full human size. Okay. At one point, he was already quite big, probably the size of a 10-year-old kid or something. And the woman he really liked, the young woman he really liked, dropped her cross to dig out a root. Everybody else was doing it. So what he did is he snuck inside it because he was getting really tired. That was what was said anyway. And when she was finished, she picked up the cross. It was a little heavier, but she didn't mind. And so while she was, and then they all decided to go home. And so when she oh, that's the other thing. She dropped in on top of the cross this great big heavy root that she dug up, and it knocked him out. Okay, so he came to about halfway back, and he's been aware of the fact that he's being carried along, and he's very hungry again. So he eats almost everything that's in the cross, and she gets home, and by this time he's quite big and she's very tired, and so she takes the big root out and she sets it to cook, and doesn't notice him. Okay, and so he creeps out of her cross, still eating everything that's left in it except for the root, and sort of hides behind the I don't know whether it was at the back of the hut or behind the hut. I'd have to check my notes how that was worded. But anyway, meanwhile, she goes next door to a hut, like 30, 20 feet away, and says, "Oh, by the way, I did get that really nice marama root, and I'm cooking it right now. Can I bring it over and we can share it?" Because I guess this was with her mother's or her sister's household or something that she had next door. And and so they said, "Oh, sure, okay." And then in the meantime, because she had taken it out of the fire to cool before she went to give this generous offer, um, the guy had found it. God had found it and eaten it. It was gone. So she gets there and she looks around. Where is it? And she goes around to all the households. There were like 4 other households in that camp, and accuses everybody of stealing it, and they all say, "No, we wouldn't do a thing like that. We've got plenty of food. You're crazy," kind of thing. She says, "Well, what happened to it?" Oh, and they are all mad at her and everything. So she goes back to her hut, and she doesn't even want to bother eating now. And then she lifts her cross to see if there's some berries. There's nothing left in it. They've stolen everything. So now she's really pissed off, and she decides, "I'm just going to go to sleep." So she gets into bed. It's evening now. The fire's dying down. Everybody's quieting, and goes to sleep. And at this moment, God, now the size of a full grown, human male, I guess, creeps around and gets under her blankets with her. It's, oh, you were so beautiful. You were so beautiful. And she says, who are you? Right? You're not. And she gave me some name. It was the name of her, I don't know, was it her young husband or her fiance or something, the man that she was going to be marrying soon. That's why she had a separate hut. Who are you? And he, he didn't care. He just wanted to get his way with her. He was going to rape her, essentially. And so, no, she wasn't having any of this. She pulled out her knife, because they all have knives and stuff, right, for cutting roots, among other things. And she just cut off his testicles, just like that. And he went, ah, popped right out of existence. I'm telling you the way the story was told to me, with all the sound effects. Anyway, so then the balls in their little sack were left behind, right? She looked around, she said, where'd this guy go, right? And she saw these little balls hopping along, right? And so she called upon her friends, the bees. And I said, well, wait a minute, people don't talk to bees. And they looked at me, the storyteller looked at me and says, this is a myth. In other words, it's a story, get with it. So, okay, so she calls the bees to sting the testicles, okay? Now what you have to picture here, the bees are stinging, right? The little sacks are hopping up and down every time they're stung, and they're trying to get away, and you have to picture something like a sack race now, okay? I mean, that's how it was described to me. And she saw them disappear over, the next little sand dune, and thought, good riddance, what was that? And she couldn't figure out what had happened. And so she, again, went to all the other huts and accused everybody, all the men there, of having tried to rape her. Okay. Now this was just too much. And now everybody was really mad at her, and they were all telling her off. And so by this point, she said, all right, I'll prove it. And so she went out and she looked for these balls. Okay. She tracked them. It wasn't hard, little sack. Anyway, she finally found they had buried themselves in the sand to get away from the bees. All right. So she pulled them out, and in the meantime, I guess they died or something. I don't know. Anyway, she went and showed them to people and said, see, here are his testicles. And everybody handled them and looked at them and sniffed them. And they said, yeah, they do smell. They might be good to eat. Right? And so they cooked them and ate them, and they were delicious. They were the first Kalahari truffles. The origin of the Kalahari truffle, one of the most expensive of all truffle varieties. Just look it up, okay? I just about fell over backwards when he hit that punchline in the story. I couldn't believe it, But that's the story. Okay, so now here, you have to remember, this story was told on one of the times, at one of the times that I had a bunch of families invited for dinner at my camp, okay? And it was told in front of a whole range of children. It wasn't just an adult story, okay? And the children were reacting to it. Some of them may have heard it before, but I started thinking about later. I thought, what are these children learning? Well, for one thing, they're learning that, once you incorporate as a material being, even if you're, the creator of the universe, you can really screw up. You can really do, silly things and have crazy ideas and all this. That's a sort of trickster model, right? But as a result of your mistake, good things can happen. Like every little hole that oozed sperm, right, from those balls as the bees were stinging them and they were trying to get away, gave rise to the Kalahari truffles. They spread them all over the place, So there was that. And then the other thing that was really, really clear to me is that the girls were learning that you share food, that's good. You don't accuse people of not sharing or stealing or trying to rape you, because people in that society take that very seriously, and it's usually a wrong accusation, at least in that society. It's it's not the right way to deal with each other, as you know, for men to deal with women and vice versa. So God didn't even know how to, the first thing about falling in love or wanting sex. God was so ignorant, he's completely screwed up and got his balls chopped off. Okay. So the children were learning that, and they were also learning that you don't rape women or they'll chop off your balls. You know, you don't, even God can't do that. Okay. Now, this is a very, very different message from the story of little Virgin Mary, who gets knocked up by God and then is informed by his lieutenant, you know, some angel he sends down to tell her to go ahead, you know, she's going to have this baby and it's going to save the world and everything be fine. You know, excuse me, but as far as I'm concerned, Virgin Mary should have just done what this little story and told, you know, and then we wouldn't be, oh, I don't know, the idea of God the Father impregnating a teenager without her knowledge, and then getting her to go along with it, and marry some other guy, so that you know, and that all of this is so sick compared to the story I just told. I'm sorry,
Yep.
but you know, it's such a different view of the autonomy and rights of both young people, of both men and women, to interact as individuals and not on the basis of domination and subjugation, you know. So to me, that story says a lot about that kind of culture, you know. And the hunting interviews, frankly, with the girls and the boys, the men and the women in older age groups, also taught me that it's not a matter um, of domination. The choices that people make in that environment are practical and logical and ecologically sound. And that was what I learned. You know, division of labor is a way of expressing it that doesn't even come close to the original form that it took. You know, if you think, for instance, of collecting clams along a seashore, this is something women could do with predictable results. They could also manage clam beds and things like that, or oyster beds. I don't know which one they would be, or other kinds of shellfish. There would be other kinds of activities where women could participate, for instance, in blind hunting, where you're driving animals towards a hidden location. And this is the technique most often used with migratory animals that are moving in big herds. The women participate quite happily in driving the animals towards a few concealed hunters, you know. Um, but it's not a division of labor based on an idea of one sex being superior. Okay. And I think that's really important. Does that satisfy you, Chris?
Oh, more than satisfied. It's the best telling of a story, and probably the best story I've heard in a long time. Thank you so much. Absolutely
Oh,
marvelous.
you're welcome.
It's an incredible story.
Mhm.
Helga, can you say more about the young hunters and issues like bride service? Are young men coming into the girls' camp and then kind of learning to hunt with that camp,
Yeah,
or
to
how
some
does it
extent.
work?
Yeah. Well, let's put it this way: bride service. It's made it makes it seem like such an institutionalization, right? But in fact, what I saw was that the people who had the most interconnections, who had a lot of social networks and so on, both male and female,
Mhm.
marriage into their kind of circle was very desired. Okay.
Yeah.
And some of them were had all these interconnections because they were, you know, very reliable hunters. Okay. um you know, as you get older, a man of, you know, 60, 70, who's got a hunting kill rate of like one every second hunt, That's going to be a camp, where you're going to learn a lot. It's going to be a camp where there's going to be a lot more regular meat supply. Kids are going to be healthier, and it's going to be a bigger camp because everybody wants to learn from him and live there, right? So you get these kind of network hubs, and they're not all men, by any means, but in a case like that, um, the daughters of such a person will be magnets
Yeah.
of young men who want to be involved in that, and all their parents too, because the thing is that if you have a charismatic, diligent, generous, diplomatic, um, courageous person who's really learned how to hunt well, okay, and the same is true of anybody who's really learned how to heal well, or somebody who's a tremendous creator of new music, by the way. But anyway, in the case of a hunter, his daughters will attract suitors in part because they want to be in his camp. Okay. And Malapai, the young lady in the middle of that picture that you posted, she actually got married before I left to a young man called Setle, who was from a group of camps near the borehole. And he, given, the paucity of game and all the problems of trying to hunt near the borehole, he had never learned to hunt, and he idealized it, the life of the hunter-gatherer. Also he's sick to death of the racism from, the Bantu speaking people there. And he he focused on her. They fell in love, they got married, and here he was in camp. Okay. And she was really disappointed because she really liked the fact that he had access to the borehole and all the radio music and the goomba goomba dancing and everything. And she thought by marrying him, she would have more access to all this exciting outside world. Well, whereas he just wanted to get away from it. But anyway, so there's that. But one of the main reasons he was there was because he wanted to learn from her father. Okay. Her father being the fellow who said that about the chicken, right? If I ever have a chicken, okay. So hunting, being an expert hunter, was to some extent a statement of ethnic identity. Okay. Just as being a knowledgeable gatherer was a statement of ethnic identity, and the wild foods. And I've written a little paper on this somewhere in the past. Um, it it hardens, as it were, the differences between ethnic groups when you get an ethnic boundary emerging like that. And so this marriage that I saw was part of that phenomena. Now, of course, in other places, I saw marriages take place, and almost invariably, um, the young couple would reside with that girl's parents. Okay. Now, I don't know if you want to call this bride service or not. Most of it was due to the fact that young women, uh, what they told me was they wanted to be near their mothers during the early years, because when they had babies, they needed the support. And I'll tell you, I mean, I did extensive genealogies in every camp I was ever in. And what I found was it was just as frequent under the such circumstances to have the young man's parents living in the same camp for a while, anyways, after the marriage. And even grandparents and friends of both sides. And people would be coming and going, and the camp would disperse and it would regroup in other ways. But what would tend to stay together for the first few years was that girl and her mother. Okay. And the husbands they were attached to. So I don't know if you want to call the husband that the young woman was attached to as performing bride service. I know that's how it was described in the literature, and the idea being that what he was now hunting with her father for the household, and their households that for a long time were somewhat contiguous, but he wasn't doing any service. He was married to her now. He was part of their household. And gradually, as he learned to hunt better, if like in the case of Tsetla, he really needed to learn to hunt, that household began to think, the young household began to see itself as potentially, what's the word that's sometimes used? Neolocal. In other words, to just go and visit friends somewhere, to go stay with, some uncle that neither of them had seen, for a long time, or just to, go visit other people and spend, 4 or 6 weeks living in their camping party. Okay. But by that time they would have had like 1 or 2 little children. They'd want to show these children to various relatives, and quite often they would move the furthest. In other words, they had distant friends and relatives. In the case of um, Zetla, this young man, he was only sort of a quarter Kua. Okay. His mother had been a concubine of a Bakalahari man in that settlement. So he grew up basically as a sort of mixed blood, but looked down on by everybody because he was not the same. Okay, and that's part of the reason, the racism. That's one of the reasons he wanted to leave. But his mother's, I can't remember if it's his mother's father or his mother's mother, but had been Tuikwe. Okay, and they had periodically visited that borehole to visit that young woman living there. And so he missed, he wanted to present his young children and his new wife to them. And just before I left, the two of them with their little child, um plus her parents came along too, were headed for a place called Tamo, which is in the very southern edge of the Central Kalahari Game Reserve. Okay. It's a Tuikwe community. Okay. And that's when I actually began to realize that a lot of these language groups, they're not unilingual. Like they all spoke each other's language to some extent. They had friendships and to some extent a certain amount of intermarriage. My estimates were about 2% per generation of all marriages were between different language groups. Okay.
Yeah.
So this meant that the networks spread all across the Kalahari from this one little group into, regions hundreds of miles away. And it meant too that they could, in a sense, visit these other areas. There wasn't this agonistic boundary. It wasn't us, them, or anything like that. All they had to do was show up with the name who they were and who their relatives were, and somebody would say, "Oh, I know him. He's camped, a day away from here. Your friend, yeah, I remember that." And you'd be taken on trust. That's how the networking works. And the annual assemblages where these different language groups get together are times when these children form these friendships, and they last a lifetime. And even if you only get to visit your friend from childhood maybe 3 or 4 times every decade, it still counts. We do it too.
Yeah.
What do you think? Our visiting and everything else, visiting relatives, we visit friends. What do you think our conferences are? Our academic conferences, those are all part of the same kind of networking system. But anyway, somebody else had a question, I think.
Yeah.
Or left, I don't know.
Chris has got his hand up, but is anybody else want a question? And then Chris, did you want another question?
Well, just on bride service. So, Helga, I think some of us in RAG, although we know that all these concepts are completely useless and inappropriate, some of us actually quite like bride service as opposed to the idea of weddings and marriage, because it's important to stress that you don't have a wedding and thereafter the man has conjugal rights in his wife, like she can't say no from that point onwards. So I just perhaps, would you just say a little bit about, because even the word wife and husband or weddings or marriages and stuff, are obviously all these are pretty much as useless as the other concepts you've been discussing, but could you just say a bit about what constitutes a wedding and what constitutes marriage and what kind of rights or a man does have or doesn't have in the person that we're over here calling his wife?
Well, there's no real wedding. It's it's a coming together. She builds her own hut. Okay. She has already been in a relationship with this young man. They're clearly in love. Okay. The parents approve, his parents approve. They all come together in the same camp, and they see this young couple enter their own hut. And then usually the mother is really pleased, because this means that this girl is going to get really serious about gathering and not lie around sleeping all day or visiting her pals in the next camping site. um, for the young man, it's a point where he has to get really serious about becoming one of the men and learning to hunt properly. It's the initiation. It's like you know, you're an adult now kind of thing. You got to try to be an adult now. Um, in a sense, I think when hunter gatherers were first studied, when the first ethnography was done, as Chris just pointed out, terminology was applied that formalized what we saw, right? But I think the main purpose of a wedding, a formalized marriage in subsequent societies, has to do with the rights to claim that any children that are born for your own lineage. And hunter gatherers don't have lineages by and large. I mean, I know the Northwest Coast ones seem to have a kind of incipient system and so on, but they're not tribal, okay, in the sense of having, lineages and sort of senior headmen and people who can be in charge of things, and who have to somehow assemble task forces from, the young people within the lineage to get things done. That kind of becomes a necessary form of social organization when you have much, much more work that has to be done in groups. And, forming a temporary task force for to drive game or something, or to undertake a group hunt, that doesn't necessarily produce a permanent leader. Okay. It's just the best person for the job. I mean, I know that the best tracker always took over the tracking. It was understood, and everybody else was closely watching what he was doing. Okay. And, there were all kinds of people who were acknowledged to be the authorities, the people who knew the most about something, like this lady who knew all about giraffes. Okay. And people deferred to it because most people are not that interested in giraffes, or the minutiae of how to get an arrow straight. There was a guy that everybody really liked to get digging sticks from, because he had the technique down really, really well about how long to leave it in the coals to make it hard, and then to sharpen it really well. And he selected the best wood, and on and on, and everybody could sort of make a digging stick, but digging sticks from him, if you could get one from him as a gift, that was a big deal. Okay. So, and people would actually go to watch him make his tools, because he was the expert. One of the things that really bothers me about recent writings on, the transition to farming and all the rest of it, is that the idea is that individualism and specialization emerged after.
Yeah.
It didn't. It didn't. I mean, hunter gatherers even have hobbies. There are people who like watching birds, and they've looked at the minutia of all the differences, and they worry about their, this is human. This isn't something, individualism isn't something that emerged when we became members of state societies or agricultural communities or anything like that. So anyway,
That's good.
did somebody speaking? Sorry.
We've got Jerome here. We've got a lot of people here who need to.
Yeah.
And Bruce Parry.
Any other questions?
Is that Denise
Jerome.
Arnold?
Denise Arnold.
It is Denise Arnold, yes. And Jerome, you want to say something? And then William.
Jerome, yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for that, Helga. Lovely to see you again after a few years.
Yeah, it's been since Vienna, right? Yeah.
That's right, yeah. And that was really so nice to get your sort of explanation of the, well, what's often called paracultivation, this gentle encouragement of the wild resources of a landscape and how human beings enhance these resources, not just for themselves, but of course every other animal that enjoys those resources too. And I just, have you published anything on that?
Well, I'm trying to. In fact, I sent something to the journal. What's it called now? It used to be Before Farming, and I never got any word back. Yeah. I sent something to that journal of human evolution and ecology, and I got turned down. I don't know. I could send it around to you guys if anybody wants to critic it and give some comments. You know,
send it to me, because I'm surprised we haven't received that at Hunter Gatherer Research. I'm one of the co-editors, so please do send it. I'd be very interested in publishing that. I think it's very important.
Well, yeah, I think so too. And I think part of the thing is maybe I'm too I'm not academic enough in the way I describe it. I'm so tired of these dry abstracts and everything else. You know, I'm not really good at that. But you know, the other thing I think is that in the intervening years since Vienna, I have actually been, you know, where I presented all that stuff on networking and dependency ratios and so on, which I didn't even talk about here now. But since then, so much more material has come out on the use of fire ecology, the use of replanting, you know, the whole discovery that the Amazon forest is basically a man-made food forest, you know, and I think that started long before people were using slash and burn there, you know. The fact that Australian hunter-gatherers had actually managed wildfires there for centuries, or thousands of years, in a way that prevented massive forest loss and die-off, you know. The fact that the very similar information on ecological engineering exists worldwide, California, northern Alberta, along the East Coast and so on. And it's not just engineering using fire ecology, it's management of hydrology, you know, to keep the wild fish populations up. It's management of other species like wolves. You know, why, you know, what I touched on before, why not eat wolves and lions in the Kalahari? Because they keep us healthy. They keep the game healthy. You know, that awareness is still not penetrating. I saw a kind of a horrifying, to me, report on the Hadza recently. It was on YouTube. It was something about wild and free. I can send you the link. And this guy is interviewing these young Hadza guys on what's important and how they hunt. And I found out from that they were hunting at night with dogs and spears, and they were hunting baboons. Baboons. The Bushmen would be horrified by that. They said that's like eating people. You know, and actually, I mean, that may be the way that they present it.
Baboons as relatives, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And the thing is that must be new, but anyway, I mean, it's like a taboo that probably kept people healthy, because the diseases carried by wild primates are much more easily transmittable to humans, and you really don't want to kill those animals and touch them and get close to them. Like, look at Ebola. Where did that come from? You know, I mean, so the fact that they're hunting baboons, that they're killing and eating anything, that they're no longer hunting with bows and arrows much, you know, like nothing subtle, you know, nothing involving distance hunting. That really worried me.
That would be quite recent, that only years of dogs, because they were certainly hunting poisoned arrows within 10 years ago.
I was really horrified. Anyway, the thing is that pattern that I saw, and there's a little YouTube video on it, a couple of them that he did actually, and presented there. the pattern of hunting with dogs and spears at night, right? That was emerging in places very close to the Bantu settlements. And that's because the game had a very big flight distance there, and they had to kill anything they could. You know, most of the really good game was gone. Okay. The animals had far too much fear of humans to be approached to get them with a poison arrow and hunt them quietly. In fact, you couldn't get them you couldn't approach them at night in daytime at all because the flight distance was so huge. And the only Kua that I spoke to who had this problem and were starting to hunt with dogs and spears were the ones right near the Bantu settlements who had, you know, like the people in the Katlang district and some of the people down in the Western Kweneng who were in areas long settled by Bakalahadi. And they had kind of given up with their proper hunting methods because the animals' behavior had changed. You know, it takes the estimate now is between 7 and 12 generations in a population of wild animals is required to eliminate the fear of a certain predator, you know. And the best estimation, the best illustration that I can give you of how that works is what happens in national parks. You've all been to a national park, right? A place where, you know, wild animals are still living. And what happens there, I don't know, if Algonquin Park, Banff, Yellowstone, is that the visitors come and the animals just walk right by them. In fact, they come up for potato chips. Okay. And that becomes a danger. You know, the bison are no longer afraid of people. The elk are you know, wapiti are sleeping all over the golf course and people can't play their games. You know, I've been to these places, Jasper and Banff, it's a real problem. Okay. That means the animals have a culture, and within that culture, they pass on to each new generation what critters you have to be afraid of, what things you must be afraid of. And if they go for many, many generations without any attacks by humans, humans are fine. Humans are fine. Don't worry about the humans. In fact, they'll give you food. That's what's told to these young animals, you know. And I think our original hunting and gathering system was developed, including the fire ecology and all the replanting and everything else, at a time when most game populations were extremely endangered. You know, there were mega droughts in Central Africa. They, you know, 4 or 5 times that were so severe that like Lake Malawi was evaporated. Like it was like a muddy little death canyon or something. You know, it was almost gone. That's how bad these droughts were. Can you imagine what the fires were like? They had to defend themselves. The people had to develop ways of preventing these wildfires from overcoming them in whatever refuge areas were able to retreat to, where there was still an ecosystem to support them. And of course, they didn't just go there by themselves. All of the game animals and the types of plants that were critical to their survival, those were right there in these refuge areas with them. And at that point, if you start, you know, going after a herd of gazelle or dikers or elephants or anything else with a spear with a bunch of guys, right? Those animals are going to disappear. You know, you can't hunt animals in a small contained area with great frequency, loudly and obviously, because you know anybody who survives that particular hunting experience is going to be really frightened every time they see humans after that, right? And predator fear, we now know, there's quite good data on this, can actually interfere with the reproductive abilities of animals. Animals will abandon their young. Birds will just not even have nests. They'll just, you know, drop eggs everywhere. They won't even feed their young if they have any. And pregnancies will end in abortions in wild game animals much more frequently where there's enormous fear of hunting. Okay, so the keystone role of the human as a hunter in the African environment, right, was probably good in the same sense that the keystone role of wolves in Yellowstone, which has now been well documented, restoring them to Yellowstone caused a change in behavior of the animals. They didn't overgraze, fear of the hunter meant that they moved differently, and the whole ecosystem, in a sense, revived because the areas near rivers and lakes were no longer overgrazed, and so on. Well, I'm sure that humans worked in a very similar way. They were added to a suite of predators. Okay, but in addition to that, they weren't just hunters, as I've just explained. Most of what they did was enriching and diversifying the ecosystem. They created hotspots of plant growth, and a lot of the material that they were doing, and this is probably true for millions of years, was beneficial. Okay, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why humanity evolved as a successful species. It wasn't just the man the hunter role. Okay, it wasn't just the keystone hunter role. It was the ecological engineering role. And at the point where we had these mega droughts in Africa, in Central Africa, and people were confined to small refuge areas with the whole viable ecosystem that they were dependent on, they had to learn to look after that ecosystem and the animals within it. And one of the things they learned was to reduce predator fear if they could. And you only do that by not appearing to be hunting them. Okay, and so you learn to hunt very, very quietly, little bows and arrows, something which the rest of the herd won't even remember. And that way you reduce predator fear, you reduce stress. Sometimes by using fire ecology, you prevent wildfires. So everything they were doing was conserving and preserving those ecosystems. And until we understand this as a culture, Western civilization as a culture, we will not stop doing the opposite: logging, overfishing, destroying wildlife everywhere we find it, all the poisons that we spread out. If we're going to save humanity, the hunter-gatherers are the key.
Yes.
Thank you. I have one question, Helga, but I'll leave that because I see other people have got questions and I'll come back to it later.
Okay.
But thank you very much.
So William, and then Denise, and then we'll come back to Jerome.
Okay.
William?
Yes.
Hi, yes. I had a is there any information on two spirits there, whether men would stay with the women and women would go with the men?
You mean homosexuality and transsexuality?
Well, yeah, that's
Yeah,
if you want to
sure.
reduce two spirit to that, yeah.
Yeah, sure. In fact, such people were treasured. I'll tell you why. Here's a case. I mean, I actually observed this. There's these two men who formed a household together. I assumed, I mean, nobody ever said anything. And I was sort of, I didn't want to give offense or appear too inquisitive. So I've never came out, I mean, under the same cross. Anyway, they were older guys and everybody adored having them in their camp. Why? Because they were both decent hunters. They were good storytellers. And the one was a bit of a, he could do some good healing as well. But they were really decent hunters. They were older. They'd had experience. They dropped the ratio of no-show hunts to successful hunts in the camp quite a bit. In other words, they increased the supply of meat to the whole camp because they had no other dependents except each other, right? And so, the fact that you have the occasional gay couple in a hunter-gatherer camp is such a benefit to the meat supply and the sort of level of security within the whole camp that, as far as I can tell, I mean, I think this was actually selected for, in a way, if you know what I mean. I don't think it was certainly not seen as something negative. Now, two spirit, I'm not sure about. I do know that one of the healers, uh, I always thought he was really a woman, you know, but you know, was accepted as a man and everything else. Of course, there would be no question of, you know, medical intervention or operations or hormone therapy or anything. It was just somebody who genuinely was, to my mind, neither male nor female, but tended to adopt a male role. And that was because that person was a healer. Okay. In other, you know, in other contexts, and I only met this person twice in the whole time I was in the field, because they didn't live with the group, the local a band conglomeration, or that I was spending most of my time in. They were actually not hunting; they were gathering with the women. Okay, so I'm kind of assuming that this person had grown up as a female, treated as a female child, and identified that way to a point. But then, as they became really, really interested in healing, it was part of an identity that was generally considered male or something. I just don't know what to put of it. But certainly, that person was not subject to any prejudice that you know, that I could see.
Great.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you. And I had so many more too, because you know I live in Northern California, and you didn't talk on the fire thing.
Oh yeah, no, I know. Well, I was trying to sort of subdue myself and not talk about too many different subjects.
Yeah.
So, and
Denise,
Yeah,
question,
thank you.
Denise?
Helga, I was really fascinated by your remarks about the feline as like the hunter par excellence, um,
uh-huh.
and the way that people, the hunters themselves, treated felines. What other kind of things did they do in their relationship with felines? And when they had a kill, did they leave an offering of a part of the kill for the felines?
Oh, well, if it was a lion kill, I only saw this once, but at a lion kill, they chased the lions away, right? And then they took a haunch, and then they left the rest for the lions. Because you know, it wasn't fair to take the whole thing, you know, but the haunch was just too tempting, I guess. They came home and everybody got a piece of it. It was a lot of meat on it. It was I can't remember if it was a hartebeest or a wildebeest, but you know, they. But the other thing is, I don't know if you ever saw this, but there were conferences. This one was held in Panama, of elders from various tribal and band level societies, and one of the elders came from a part of the Kalahari, and he recounts this thing about leaving um, just before leaving for the conference. He came out of his hut and he was kind of walking around. And he walked around a bush and there was a lioness sitting there. And he said, you know, I looked at her, she looked at me. I, you know, not a he made some gesture of respect, and then he just walked quietly on. And then he talks about how his people do not see the lions as dangerous or bad. They see them as kinsmen. I can send you that report if you like. But that's definitely what I found. Like I know that the Kua told me after seeing this body compound, they told me that they were horrified by what they saw. And what was in the pictures? It was a picture of a lion's head that had been cooked, being eaten by a Bakalahari man. And because he had a couple of other people around him and he was sharing with them. And they just said this was completely unconscionable, you know. But of course, the Bakalahari have cattle, and sometimes lions do attack people. And so I assume this animal was shot by one of the, one of the men in the group. and they decided to eat it rather than just let it lie there waste. I don't know what the details were, but I know that the reaction that I got when I showed people this picture was one of real disgust. I don't know if that helps, but
Right.
anyway,
Okay.
you know, most of the time leopards. Oh, the leopard at my camp. I had a leopard that when I had a little camp next to Tloatle's camp, right? And for a couple of nights in a row, I heard this sound, right? And I realized it was a leopard walking around the camp. It was curious, right? And 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 I did a very foolish thing. I guess I walked on the inside and I went back at it. I was kind of playing with it. I don't know what I was thinking, but it worked, you know, and the leopard eventually left. And everybody was very amused by this. You know, the leopard was not seen as a danger to either myself or the other group. Now, perhaps if I had been more frightened, or if I'd been, you know, made hysterical by it or tried to shoot it or something, the leopard would have thought again about how to interact with humans. I don't know, but I will tell you one thing: there was a big cobra um, near the camp where I originally was staying, right? And when I was setting up my camp, one of the women came over and she said she was going to introduce me. Okay. And she walked over and we walked around for a while. And she was looking and looking. Then we finally saw the cobra, and it was just relaxing. You know, it was just lying, you know, under the branches of a tree. And she said, "Now you just have to watch this. You don't want to step on this." Okay. And I said, "My God, you know, okay, so you know about the snake. Thank you for telling me. Why camp near it?" She said, "Oh no, it's very helpful because it cuts down on all the vermin. In other words, mice and other little things that come and gnaw the, you know, come around the camp, and it deters those." I had no idea, you know. So if that helps at all. The other thing, come to think of it, um, that strikes me about the way hunter-gatherer literature is often viewed is that people, you see these statements all the time that, you know, people couldn't afford to settle down, they couldn't stay in one place because the food wasn't enough and all this kind of stuff. That's not what I was told at all. Nobody left because there was no food, ever. Not if it was a, you know, intact ecosystem that they were in. They left because they had to go to a party or somebody's christening, or they had to go visit a friend, or they'd promised somebody else to camp with them. They had social engagements. Okay. That it wasn't hunger. Okay. And it wasn't even that the local food supply was gone. Right. There was plenty. I mean, I was sometimes surprised when people would suddenly decamp, you know, and because then I'd have to pack up and go along. Right. But here's the thing. One of the reasons they gave, now this is kind of creepy, but anyway, here we go. One of the main reasons they gave, and also one of the reasons why they really did not like settlements, the Kalahari settlements and the settled borehole areas, was because of ticks, fleas, mites, and other vermin that built up there.
Right.
Okay. And I can speak from personal experience because when I was first in the field, a very kind Bakalahari headman, when I was, you know, interviewing, because I did all these interviews with the Bakalahari as well, offered me a hut for the night. Okay. And unwisely, I said, "Oh, how nice, how kind." And at that point, it was early on in my field work, and SG, my guide interpreter, he opted to sleep in the truck, right? And he said, "Oh, you go," you know, we'd always trade off. I slept not at all because I was so covered in flea bites and mites and I don't know what else was biting me all night that I would never ever do that again, you know. And I think, you know, one of the things that you have to remember is that we settled humans, you know, with our civilization and everything else, long history of towns and settled houses and permanent fixtures and all the rest of it. I think we tend to elevate that to a status where we assume that human beings have always wanted to live like this. Okay. And I frankly doubt that. I think if you have a choice, you just go camping and you move frequently and you visit people all over the landscape and you have your whole garden around you and you just, you know, you're not going to worry about food or anything like that. You spend your whole life camping. It's fabulous. What do we do when we're on vacation? We go camping. A lot of us anyways, you know. And if we don't go camping, then we go visit friends and relatives. We fly all over the world to keep up our contacts, and we go to conferences, right? Well, they get to do that without, you know, the airplanes and all the rest of it, but they also don't have the housework. Trust me, I have 6 huge dogs now, wolfhound crosses. The housework. Just at first, I've sometimes thought, oh, if only I was a hunter-gatherer, you know, I could just move away with dogs, and I wouldn't have to use the vacuum cleaner and the broom so much, you know. And you think it's a lot of work to be a sedentary person.
Yep.
It's a lot of work, a lot more work to be a farmer. Huge amount of work, you know. And that,
Jerome, do you want to come in?
what's that?
Chris, you've.
Oh, sorry. There was just a couple more questions. Jerome and Chris both coming in, but Jerome, do you want to go, and then Chris, and then anybody else?
Right. Okay, well, my question really is to return to the first thing that you talked about, which is this burial of a young girl with her hunting equipment in South America. Now, the criticism that people like me level against those kinds of extrapolations is that you have one single case, and then you suddenly extrapolate to a whole sort of hypothesis of, you know, women being these big game hunters or whatever it is that those archaeologists are saying. But, you know, at the same hand, in the same way, they criticize people like me for elaborating from the basis of extant living hunter-gatherers and their life ways to critique their assumptions about the past. And I just wondered how you deal with that situation, in the sense that you have just offered us a very vivid account of how some San people engage and live with their environment, as a sort of counter to the assumption that women would have been hunters in the past. So I just wondered, what in terms of the theory behind what you're saying, how can you justify critiquing their assumptions through the examples given by living people?
Okay. Well, I didn't emphasize it perhaps enough, that my critique of that series of speculations that resulted from the finding of that girl, that critique arises from economic analysis. Hunting and gathering is an economy. It's an economic system. In other words, it's a particular, pardon me, it's a particular system of interacting with a local ecosystem. And it involves the learning of particular skills, certain practices that lead to a sustainable interaction with that ecosystem. Sorry, I don't know what I've got. I must have got a frog in my throat. And the analysis of it as an economy means that worldwide, if we look at every single hunting and gathering ethnography that's been done, there are certain consistent elements. Okay. And the fire ecology, the ecological engineering is one of those consistent elements that's becoming more obvious all the time. The organization, the social organization that tends to occur in mobile hunter in particular. The bilateral kinship system network, internal logic of the society that follows from that kind of an economy. And I don't think, in spite of all the stuff that's been in spite of all of the objections to this sort of more consistent picture of what makes a hunter-gatherer economy work, I think that stood the test of time. I mean, how long have we been studying hunter-gatherers? And the essential aspects of it, the fact that it is not associated with starvation generally, it's not associated with a lot of agonistic behavior, because diplomacy and visiting and exchange of information is a far better survival strategy in an economy like that than agonistic encounters. Certainly between bands, you don't see anything like that happening between bands. Okay. Yeah. These kind of consistencies, I think, are important. And the fact is that I can see two major areas where people are trying to create an alternative. This one about the labor, which is one we talked, right? The other one is the political egalitarian. Very widely that there's nobody's going to go hungry if they're in a hunter camp, in a hunter-gatherer society. It's being attacked right now. What is going on with this recording business? That's really weird.
Great. Chris,
Oh, well.
Can you hear? Chris?
Yes, it's simply the fact that my Wi-Fi conked out and we didn't get an extra person to do the recording, so I'm afraid those bits have gone.
Oh,
it's annoying. So when
okay,
maybe just switch it off.
so when I
Maybe
come,
just switch it off. It's just
I don't want to switch the recording off because we're going to meet Miss Helga. I'm going to leave it on.
okay.
okay.
Please carry on,
And-
Helga. Yeah.
I actually, after my experience in the went home and wrote my thesis up and everything else, but I was hunted by the International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics. And so I decided to take that job because they wanted to send me to West Africa. And they wanted to send me to West Africa, where I would be staying in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, mostly in Burkina Faso, and studying in detail the economy of pastoral people. They were mostly horticulturalists, the farming people, and the pastoralists were classic, mobile pastoralists, the Fulani, at least traditionally. And what I wanted to understand was two things. One is, did ecological engineering continue? Was it consistent with these other economies? Okay. Was I going to be able to find evidence of, some kind of understanding of fire ecology, understanding of creating ecological mosaics? Was the pastoral creating ecological hotspots, which is one of my interests. And with pastoralists, I didn't get to do that much research, but I was gratified to see some sometime about a year and a half or 2 years ago, a young woman out of Washington University reported on the fact that uh, in the Serengeti, where pastoralists had been, creating temporary camps for thousands of years, that they were creating ecological hotspots because of the manure, concentrated manure of the animals, but probably also for the same things that I was describing among the hunter-gatherers. In other words, they were bringing a lot of food there, spitting out seeds and all the rest of it, right? I mean, think about what humans do. We're a provisioning primate. We have a base camp, even if the base camp is New York City, right? And what we do is we concentrate um, resources in these places and provision our dependents. Okay, as a result, we produce, particularly in these other economies, proliferations of um, wild and now domestic plant varieties, animal varieties that the ones we use the most. So we've actually been, I think, even in tribal economies, we've been able to produce sustainable systems of economic uh, behavior interacting with ecosystems in a positive way that creates long-term sustainability and also preserves the diversity of the wild resources, the wild animal and plant resources. And so I would extend that understanding to all what we call indigenous people worldwide, not just hunter-gatherers. Their systems of economic action within those ecosystems are not universally destructive. In fact, they're the opposite. And if we don't, as anthropologists, if we don't get that message across soon, I don't know what's going to happen to us as a species.
Yeah,
It worries me.
I agree. Thank you, Helga.
Thank you. Two more questions. William and Chris. Chris, do you want to say something? And then maybe we're wrapping up.
Yes. So I'm just so glad that I kind of came in from the side and asked you about God's testicles. And I've got another question, which also is kind of coming from nowhere. So it's about your experience of how time is measured and how future occasions are sort of specified. So I'm thinking about the sun and the moon, of course, but in particular, when you're talking about the lions, I'm sure you're aware of the extraordinary, marvelous descriptions by Elizabeth Marshall Thomas of what she calls the shift system between the lions and the humans, where the lions have the night and the humans have the day. And of course, it then makes a very big difference whether the night is a full moon or the night is a dark moon. And I'm just hoping you will add to my fascination with those questions.
Oh,
Any
wow.
ideas? Any
Yeah,
anecdotes?
night and day. Well, the thing is, nighttime. This is a bit of a digression from what you were saying, but one of the things that I did learn right towards the end of my fieldwork was how incredibly detailed the memorization of nighttime constellations was.
All right.
How much attention was paid to kind of predicting, like everybody, of course, knows night, day, seasonal changes, everything is predictable and so on. They were interested in predicting, eclipses just like everybody else. But what really got me was the fact that I had paid no attention to night sky as a really important navigational tool, constellations and so on. And what got me to understand this was just before I left, a number of the people, mostly kids, gave me ostrich eggs. Okay. And these are decorated. I don't know if they're decorated in other parts of the Kalahari. I understood that they probably aren't, but they had always decorated their eggs. And it was mostly kids doing etchings. Okay. And so I saw this one egg, and I wish I could hold it out for you, but I donated them all to the university archaeology lab here at the University of Alberta. But there was a what looked like a snake on the egg. And I said, "Oh, is this, and I asked if it was that cobra kind of thing. And the little kid looked at me and he said, "No, it has nothing to do with earthly things. It has nothing to do with the common things." And at night, and then he pointed at the constellation Hydra.
Wow.
That's what it was.
Wow.
And a lot of these designs that they were putting on these eggs were constellations. Some of them were representations of animals, but they were constellations. They were using stories about, various events in a kind of mythological sense to help the kids remember these constellations. And they were practicing them all the time, usually by drawing in sand. But I sometimes you're thinking in terms of a numerical sense or an awareness of recording time and changes in time, being aware of the night sky, being aware of the movement of constellations, being aware of, being able to predict these things. That is definitely highly developed, and it's so far pretty much overlooked in a way, and it kind of bothers me that we've had so many other things take precedence when we study hunter-gatherers. Just their very survival now is in question, and we haven't even, as far as I'm concerned, scratched the surface of their science.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Great.
Wait, William, have you got one last question? And then maybe we're wrapping up.
Yeah, it's a quick observation more than a question, but I would like to see if Helga has an answer. I have heard that God's Balls stories before. I read it somewhere, and I can't remember. The most likely place I read it was there's a big collection that was done in the late 1800s, I think it was, of South African stories among the Bushmen. I
Which
believe
story had you heard before? I'm sorry.
God's Balls.
Oh, really? Well, I'm
Mhm.
sure it's very widespread. They didn't invent it for my
But
benefit.
the more interesting thing is my first inclination was that I read it in The Raw and the Cooked, Levi Strauss,
Oh, that'd be
which
interesting.
would mean it's all the way over here, which means it's one of those really old stories.
Well, there are a lot. I should talk to Megan Beasley more about this, because my collection of mythology was very limited. It wasn't what I was focused on, but I have a couple of other stories. One in particular, which I call what would it called? Um, the poisonous farts. the story, the story of the poisonous farts, which is a story about God coming to Earth to rectify a problem. Oh, the first part of the story is called the buffalo wife and the poisonous farts. Okay, which is even more confusing for you, I'm sure. But Megan has a very similar story from 1,000 miles away, where instead of a buffalo wife, it's an elephant wife. And I suspect that this story of a human who mates with an animal, marries, falls in love with an animal, and then has to be pulled back from that error is very, very widespread. The mermaid story comes from this, I think. The story in Scotland about selkies, the sea lions come into human society as a beautiful, you know, beautiful young woman, and many other stories that sort of indicate that the tie between humans and animals is very intimate enough that we can, in a sense, almost see kinship with them, intermarrying with them, and that it's only because of God's the deity's rules and interruptions that we pulled back, and children are pulled back. There's a term for it, in a sense. I think it's biophilia, the love of life, the love of living things. And this is so critical to the way that humanity functions. I mean, why do we have houseplants? By the way, that's a mini Rex. Anyway,
I just heard
why do
about
we have
your rabbits.
what's that?
I just heard from Jerome about you've got rabbits.
Yeah. So, the thing is, we respond, every little child responds at first with wonder and joy, even at the sight of, like ants, little critters, but we just adore living things, especially baby things, right? And most of the people I know don't even think about this. Why do we have gardens? Why do we bring flowers? I mean, really, the genitals of plants when we go to a funeral. I mean, just think about it. But it's biophilia. It's like these are the most extraordinary and representative tokens that nature provides us. Okay, so the love of the natural world, I think, is something that we have to be taught to differentiate ourselves, but also to be, respectful to it. And I see this in a lot of mythology, Anyway, I'm talking too much, but maybe you could have me back another time for anything we've missed today.
I think we will.
Yeah, it's been a fantastic talk, and you covered so many things and got so many people enthralled, and without PowerPoint is absolutely wonderful to just hear people talking.
No, it's fun.
Also, so nice.
Okay.
So yeah, we're definitely everyone's very thankful for it. We'll definitely want you to come back and hear some more about it all. So thank you so much, Helga.
Okay, you're welcome.
It's been a fascinating insight. So many things come up that we could follow up.
Oh, I meant to ask, there's this thing about chat at the bottom of the page. I haven't even gone there to look.
Yeah, it's chatting. There's a few questions.
I could send it to you if you like. I could send it to you. I could send it to you.
I wouldn't mind seeing what people chatted. Maybe I'm too sure. Anyway, I have to go and feed my horses now, so I have to.
Okay.
All right.
Me too.
Thank you so much. Thank you.